It is a delight to have you all here for this, the third evening in this series of lectures celebrating the life and intellectual legacy of C.S. Lewis. As I have mentioned on previous occasions, Lewis is generally known for either his work as a Christian apologist or for his more popular Narnia Chronicles. However, this particular series is devoted to an exploration of the wider scope of Lewis's interests, his writings, and his intellectual contributions to a wide variety of different areas of thought. As someone who devoted his life to the life of the mind, Lewis continually wrestled with the deep philosophical concerns about how we think, the nature of our reason, and the role of imagination. But as the literary scholar that he was, Lewis's thinking about the nature of thought was always grounded in the concrete literary texts that he studied. Moreover, as artifacts of the historic past, these great books, to which Lewis devoted his life of study, forced Lewis to contemplate not merely the nature of thought, but also the role that studying such objects as literature and history play in forming our thinking. Lewis expressed some of his reflections on these matters in his 1957 essay, Is History Bunk? I love that title, Is History Bunk? This is a delightful way of asking, does the study of history really matter? Now, if you asked a typical undergraduate today, and I see that we have some typical undergraduates in our audience, whether history is bunk or whether the study of history matters, I suspect that a significant portion of them, though none at Union, a significant portion of them would be inclined to think that history is bunk, that it doesn't really matter whether we study history or not. Moreover, I suspect that those students who thought that history was not bunk, or who thought that history does matter, would likely offer a practical or a pragmatic justification for studying history. They might say that we ought to study history so that we can learn from the mistakes of the past so that we're not doomed to repeat them. That's probably a very common thing you hear about why we ought to study history. Now, as noble as such a motive as this sounds, Lewis was none too keen on it. And in the essay that I just mentioned, Lewis calls this pragmatic response Fordism, named for Henry Ford, that pioneer of industrialized production of the automobile. Now, let me be clear that in calling the pragmatic justification for the study of history Fordism, Lewis is not being complimentary. For Lewis, to treat history as merely an instrument toward the production of other interests we may have is to treat a subject which has worth in and of itself in the same way that Ford's assembly line manufacturing system treated people, as merely a degraded tool. Thus, Lewis's defense of history was partly grounded in his broader view of the value of liberal arts in general, subjects whose study is valuable for their own sake and not merely for any additional practical purpose. Tonight, to help us see and understand Lewis's views on history in greater depth, we are honored this evening to hear from a scholar and a student of history, one whose teaching and scholarship embodies the Lewisian ideal of history for the sake of gratifying one's free, and I mean that in the best sense, one's free curiosity. Dr. David Thomas received his Ph.D. from The Ohio State University in 1993, and they are currently also undefeated in football. And he came to Union subsequent to that in 1994 and has been here ever since and presently serves as professor of history. At Union, he teaches not only introductory courses in American history, but he also teaches upper-level courses on Colonial America, the American Revolution, and Civil War Reconstruction. He is the author of the book, The Stories We Tell Our Children, How Our Past is Made Present in Children's Literature. And I should just add on a personal note, he is a constant encouragement to me in my own interest in studying the life and intellectual legacy of C.S. Lewis. And that's why I'm delighted tonight to turn the podium over to him and hear him bring us Bridges and Fords Lewis on History. Will you join me in welcoming Dr. David Thomas?
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate that. You sound like Ken Myers. And I appreciate you all being here as well. It's a privilege to get to talk about C.S. Lewis. It really is. It's a privilege to get to read C.S. Lewis and contemplate his response to history and his thinking about history. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're here together. I'm not going to be exhaustive by any means. And so I'd encourage you, certainly, as you have questions, to write them down, to note them on the back of your hand or something. It's a common experience of mine to find a question in my mind and a half an hour later have forgotten it. So write your questions down. We can have a little Q&A afterwards, and maybe we can talk together and learn something together. Asking Lewis for his ideas on history might seem a little bit odd, right? He's an English professor, for heaven's sakes. He's not a history professor. And worse yet, he's a medievalist. And I don't know how much medieval literature you've read, but the level of credulity is just astonishingly high. These people will believe absolutely anything. And then, worst of all, what's he famous for, right? He's famous for fantasy stories for children. I mean, it's almost the antithesis of what you would expect somebody well-versed in history to be writing. But it's not as bad as I'm painting it to be, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Talking about Lewis and his views on history, there's some sense to it. He was, of course, deeply invested in the past. Anybody who studies medieval literature, medieval ideas, is going to be deeply invested in people who lived and died a long, long time ago. Every now and then he spoke of himself as an ambassador of a different age, a spokesman, a specimen, which is just an odd way to describe oneself. But he had an affinity for an age which was not his own. Certainly, he is a theologically skilled and dedicated Christian. You know this. That in itself suggests some sensitivity to history. Thoughtful Christians are going to be historically minded. And finally, as just kind of a starting point for Lewis, he delighted in the past, right? And I say that not just because learning about the past made him happy, right? It's not just an emotional response. His delight is something, I think, that's very close to the heart of his scholarship. We'll revisit this near the end, but his delight shouldn't be overlooked. It's fairly important in itself. To start a lecture on history, I suppose, there's the man. I suppose I need to briefly explain what history is, right? Let me give you kind of a general definition. History is a true story about the past. I think we can do a little bit more than that, but that's a good starting point, right? Now, nobody wants to remember old names and old dates just for the sake of remembering, okay? I know you've had enough history courses to realize that that's not necessarily desirable. So we can expand that a little bit, right? History is a true story about the past that attracts our attention. For some reason. The reason doesn't really matter. Usually, though, with the hope of changing things in the present. Right? There's an action orientation there to studying history. Memory and hope walk together, right? The one looks to the past, the one looks to the future, but they operate together, and both are essential. It's not just memory. It's also hope. They go together. Janus, the god of time in Roman mythology, no surprise, he looks in both directions, right? History does this. It looks to memory, it looks to hope. So a true story about the past that attracts our attention for some undefined reason. It's a pretty good shoe. It flexes where we need to flex, okay? 3 areas of flexibility come to mind for Lewis. The level of detail. It's going to vary a lot. The level of meaning, the intensity of the meaning is going to fluctuate. And then the presence or absence of professional guidelines, of course. Detail first. Sometimes, just to continue with the sort of a definition, right? Sometimes history refers simply to the past, the whole thing. Infinite in detail. complex beyond all knowing, almost entirely unrecorded and forgotten. Just think about your day today, briefly, right? Almost the whole thing has been forgotten. My day started at about 6 o'clock, so your day's probably started later than that, I don't know. But the whole thing, unrecorded, unforgotten. You used, I don't know how much toothpaste you used when you brushed your teeth this morning, but you didn't write it down. And that's certainly an important part of the past, right? Well, maybe not important, but it's certainly part of the past. Every moment has its contribution. Every heartbeat, every emotion, every leaf falling, yet the full past is huge, right? Lewis observed this way, a roaring cataract. He said the history is a roaring cataract, billions upon billions of moments, any one of them too complex to grasp in its entirety. Absolutely. And the aggregate? Forget it. Beyond all imagination. So, of course, nobody tries to tell this whole story. Of course. Nobody can. We tell stories that matter to us. Right? However, in this sort of universal sense, not talking about professional history at all, history is something that you and I work with every day. Individually, communally, these true stories about the past are very important to everything we do. Dr. Barnard opened this lecture with a little bit of history, right? He talked for 6 or 7 minutes about Lewis's view of history and introduced me and my past, and all this is, even if he'd said something as simple as, here's Dr. Thomas, 4 words, it's still historical, right? Thomas. What kind of a name is that? Well, it's got some British associations at least, might be English, might be Welsh, but it's certainly not Sudanese or South Korean, okay? You got that one. And that, you might immediately fix that up, right? And then I'm announced as doctor, right? Well, okay, so there are historical associations in your mind with that, right? If he had announced Pastor Jung, right, then your associations are totally different. South Korean, not a doctor, but a pastor, and she's a woman. Associations are totally different. So as soon as he says, this is Dr. Thomas, then your past and my past come together, and they tell you something about me. And if you're thinking about it, they might tell you something about yourself also. We use the past like this constantly, incessantly, to sort out the true from the false, okay? Sort out the factual from the invented. Those are not the same thing. Okay? The invented is not necessarily false, and the factual is not necessarily true, or vice versa. The true is not necessarily factual. We use it all the time. So the details, yes. Okay, now meaning. What the past means, of course, will vary, partly as the detail varies, right? And it varies from person to person, community to community, age to age. The range of meaning assigned to events long ago is going to be different from the range of meaning assigned today, and it's going to be different 30 years from now. And that matters when you think about Lewis and history. And then finally, the professional guidelines. When these common everyday efforts to understand the past intensify, when people want evidence, when people want evidence that can be checked, they're still writing a true story that attracts our attention, right? That hasn't changed. But now it's limited, material evidence that we can gather, and it's separated from other less factual forms of true stories. Less factual forms of true stories like novels and drama and poetry and things like that. So professional history isn't where people begin, but it can be someplace where people end up. And this is valuable, I think, when we talk about Lewis, because Lewis, of course, wrote an enormous range of materials, academic writing and poetry and fiction and apologetics and theology. Sometimes this is professional history, literary history. Sometimes it's not. Most of the time it's not. But I guess what I'm saying here is that when you think about somebody's historical view, you're not limited to the scholarly stuff, okay? The whole corpus, the whole body of writing. Narnia is fair game too. That's a short way to put it. Narnia is fair game too. Let me offer 3 observations about Lewis on history. First of all, Lewis's view of the past is primarily Augustinian. I'll spend a couple minutes on that, not too much, I hope, just to outline what that means. Secondly, Lewis's literary histories, there are 4 of them, or 4 that contain literary histories, were controversial, they're bold, Some places they're transformative. The last of those words is most important, right? It's fairly easy to be bold. A lot of people are bold. Much more difficult to transform your field. And thirdly, of course, Lewis is an advocate for the past. He almost has to be as a professor of medieval literature, right? He sought to understand people for their own sake. And he's absolutely enchanted by medieval literature, medieval ideas. There's a delight there, understanding these people for their own sake. Of course, he also values the past for its contribution to the present. That's reasonable. And every now and then, not all the time, but every now and then, the past becomes prophetic. And it challenges. And it forces people to reconsider what they think and what they believe and how they act. Every now and then, the past unhorses, unseats the present. And Lewis is very convinced, I think, in places, that this is an important role for the past. We'll take that first. We'll take them in order, all right? Augustine first. Lewis, of course, deeply influenced by, well, the most famous reference, I think, to ancient thinkers is to Plato, isn't it? In, what's the book? The Last Battle. I'm kind of assuming that you've read the Narnian stories. I don't know if that's a valid assumption or not. I'm not assuming you've read anything else, but I am going to assume you've read Narnia. If you haven't read Narnia, don't worry about it. There are 3 or 4 examples, and if you haven't read them, you can just pass them on by. But I'm sort of assuming that when I reference The Last Battle, you know what I'm talking about. In The Last Battle, the Lord Diggory explains to all the others that Narnia was a shadow, right? It's a copy, a shadow of the real Narnia, which is, of course, Aslan's country. And he shakes his head and says, it's all in Plato, Plato, right? Bless me, what do they teach them in those schools? You've read this. Now, it's probably unwise for me to disagree with Lord Diggory, because in another book, he's Professor Kirk, and this Professor Kirk is, of course, modeled after Lewis's Professor Kirk. I'm going to disagree with him anyway, and say it's not all in Plato. It's Augustinian. And there's the good man himself, sort of. Of course, we don't know what Augustine looked like, right? But that's him, anyway, looking out the window. This is part of a series on the life of St. Jerome. Apparently, Jerome has just died and is being carried up into heaven by angels, and Augustine is looking out the window, watching, and the dog is too, watching Jerome. I didn't paint it. It's just a great picture that you can look at as I talk about Augustine. The core is Augustinian, and of course, before that, Pauline. And it gets a little bit complicated, and don't ask me to separate it out, because Augustine is, of course, in part, a Platonic thinker. And if you really want to separate Augustine from Plato, then Dr. Barnard's your man, and he's in the back of the room. But Augustinian ideas about history can be summarized. Let me give you a series of bullet points just to kind of outline it. First of all, history is a linear series of human events. Okay? It's not cyclical. It's not fluctuating. It's linear. A to B to C to D to E to F to G, and on we go. These linear events are causally connected. Okay? They're unified. It's not fragmentary. There is a universal perspective from which all these things can be seen to be connected and unified. History proceeds from the fall to the second coming. Okay, those boundaries. The fall to the second coming, not sooner than that and not later than that. And the incarnation, of course, is the turning point, right? Before the incarnation is the age of law, after the incarnation, the age of grace, and the incarnation stands at the center of the story. And sometimes you see this. George Marsden has a fairly well-known book among historians, probably not outside the world of history, where he dates important transformation in the church, and he dates the important transformation not to the resurrection and not to the crucifixion. He dates it to the incarnation. Okay, that's Augustinian thinking about history. Secondly, people are alienated from God, created order, other people, themselves. That's Augustine. You've heard that before. And again, biblical. Thirdly, the particular and the unique are important. This distinguishes Augustine a little bit from Plato's theory of forms, right? But the community is also important, all right, which distinguishes from today's forms of radical individualism and other forms of that. And they're connected because the individual finds life and purpose and worth in the body of Christ. And of course, the body of Christ, the community of believers at all times and places. This community, Augustine calls the city of God, characterized by the love of God. The alternative community is the city of the world, characterized by self-love and the will to dominate. And you can see at least elements of this. As Lewis sets up Narnia in opposition to Calormene, you can see elements of this in Tolkien, right? Where Gondor and Mordor stare at each other across the river. If you haven't read Tolkien, if you've just seen the movies, you have to read the books too. Why? Because the books capture nobility and grace in a way that the movies can't. That's why. The movies are great at picturing orcs, but nobility and grace, not so much. Fourthly, these two communities, the city of God, the city of the world, are opposed to one another, and they're defined largely by their response to Christ. Right? The one city responds to Christ with obedience and adoration, and the other city responds to Christ with rejection and hatred. And they are not equivalent in power or authority, okay? Evil is not the equal of good. Evil is a deficiency, it's a deformation. And again, you get that, I guess, probably most clearly in Tolkien, right? The city that's the counterpart to Gondor was originally a vibrant and healthy city. It was created by the men of Gondor and has since fallen, right? I'm kind of conflating Lewis and Tolkien here. But the two cities grow up together, and they grow up together like Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares. They grow up together because to destroy the one implies some destruction to the other, and so they're left alone to grow up together. And then finally, the purpose of human history. To destroy evil and redeem everything that can possibly be redeemed. Hans von Balthasar, a 20th century theologian, put it this way: the Son's action, says Balthasar, is what history is for. And I do think this comes through the Narnia stories. I'm not going to unpack all 5 of these. We can talk about that if you'd like to, but I don't want to elaborate these with examples. I want to unpack only the second point, because I think it illustrates something that's important about Lewis's view of history. The second point, the alienation, right? People are alienated from God and self and others and the created order. Lewis says this: people invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God. Okay, that's the alienation, right? Apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, list of things. Prostitution, classes, empires, slavery. That long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God that will make him happy. This is the key to history. History, in other words, is the story of human suffering. And how other people respond to suffering is often interesting. We appear to live in an age where we don't want to face suffering directly. We cover it over. We escape. And so we can learn from other ages on how they respond to suffering. And to be honest, you might look to Lewis as you face your own suffering, right? Pain, Lewis writes, is the key to understanding, and he says this in several ways, that this history, this world, is not our home. He says this in a dozen different ways, dozen different writings. And he uses some interesting images. Lewis is great for images. He's just amazing with images. His images here aren't terribly amazing, but they are fairly creative. If a fish found water uncomfortable, he says, it would suggest that a fish is not a purely aquatic creature, right? That makes sense. I guess, not being a fish. The existence of hunger, he says, suggests that food is real. the existence of thirst suggests that water is real. And this then extension is extended. The presence of pain and our response to pain suggests that pain is not normal. It's common, right? Everybody in the room suffers. But it's not normal. Instead, he says, the story of pain and the longing for home suggest that there is a place where the horror and the fear and the isolation are relieved. There is a place where the hunger for belonging is filled. This is a repeated refrain in Lewis. He says this a lot. And I think it's a profound commentary not only on suffering, but also on history. Right. History is not the sum total of human experience. It might run from the fall to the second coming, which seems like a really long time to me. But it's not the sum total, because our home is somewhere else. He put it this way: if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And I suspect he's turning to places like Hebrews 11 for this and others. Okay, Lewis's theology, Augustinian. Let me leave the details unexplored and just lay them out there for you and press on. His literary histories. They're bold, they're innovative. In places, they transform his field. He, of course, served as professor of English literature, first at Oxford and then at Cambridge, right? He was at Oxford from 25 to 54 and at Cambridge from 54 to 63. And his major works are four: The Allegory of Love, The Preface to Paradise Lost, English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama, The Discarded Image. I'm assuming that you've run into these before. Probably Dr. Fant talked about them a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to talk about two that seem to be particularly important: The Allegory of Love and then English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. Allegory of Love, not surprisingly, right? It's a study of allegory and love poetry as it developed in Western Europe, mostly emphasizing France and Italy, up to 17th century England. It's his first scholarly book. It established his reputation. Alan Jacobs observed this. Alan Jacobs' biography of Lewis is really excellent. If you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. Alan Jacobs said this: even before it was published, scholars who read this thing in draft begged Lewis to write a volume to the ongoing Oxford History of the English Literature, and that became the third one on that list. That's a little bit hard to imagine, right? My seminar students are turning in their papers. I'm going to take one of them and say, this is so amazing. You need to write a book. Holy cow, right? That's amazing. Lewis it establishes, as I said, his reputation as a remarkable scholar. The chapter on Chaucer still shapes Chaucer studies today, which is something to, there's a lot to be said for that. That's remarkable in itself. Chaucer, you remember, is a 14th century poet. He's the guy significantly responsible for making Middle English a respectable language. Okay, this is an age dominated by Latin and by French. Chaucer comes along, writes all this stuff. There he is. Here he is again. And Middle English becomes something that other people can write in. You have to admire the perspective on an illustration like that, don't you? I feel a little bit sorry for the horse, right? He's got this massive upper body and that itty-bitty horse. And then if he ever gets off of that poor horse, and his feet, his lower body just seem, oh well. I didn't draw it, right? It's a manuscript from 1410. What Lewis did, of course, was work to reinvigorate the understanding of how Chaucer was originally read. Right? How Chaucer was read by his contemporaries. This is one of Lewis's constant aims as a literary historian. How did the people of the time read him? And then, of course, what did people of that time find true and good and beautiful that we can ourselves appreciate? English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. One of the scholarly problems of the age is how to explain this tremendous burst of creativity of the late 1500s. Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, a couple other names in there, just burst onto the scene in the late 1500s. Like Chaucer, Spenser's very influential. Spenser's the first great poet not writing in Middle English, but writing in modern English. Faerie Queene was published the first half in 1590. Shakespeare's entering the theater in the mid-1500s. I'm sorry, mid-1580s. There they are. Again, the sense of proportion just is different than my own. But that's okay. Before Spenser and Shakespeare and Sidney, and there's a couple others in there, there's, of course, a lot of writing, right? These people are not just sitting around. They're writing stuff. Most of the English literature prior to Spenser, Lewis has read all of it, which is astonishing in itself. But he calls it drab. Drab. And the standard, and this is recognized, right? Other people agree with him on this. The standard explanation of Lewis's day argued that it was the humanists who lit the fuse that ignited Spenser and Shakespeare, and it's the humanists that turned this thing around so that we have this explosion of Elizabethan theater and poetry and writing. Lewis says it couldn't possibly have happened that way. The humanists couldn't possibly inspire the rejuvenation of English literature. They're far too pedantic and rules-bound and imitative. Whatever else humanism is, Lewis argued, it's emphatically not a movement towards freedom and expansion. And again, his conclusions inspired debate and influenced the field as a whole. I'm going to pass over a preface to Paradise Lost. I'm going to pass over The Discarded Image. The Discarded Image actually is kind of interesting. It's published posthumously, right? He died in 63, and this thing is published in 64. And it's a collection of his lectures to undergraduates. So it's probably less scholarly than the other three, and maybe a little bit more accessible. Looking at these four scholarly books, a few things stand out. First of all, Lewis is unusually gifted with languages and ideas. And unusually, when I say unusually, I don't just mean he was really good at it. He was. But I also mean that he had an affinity for these people that is rare. He had an affinity for an earlier age that gave him a clarity of vision. This is why sometimes he refers to himself as a specimen of the old Western order. I don't know how many of us can say that, right? I did my dissertation in Oregon in the 1830s. Doesn't mean I think like somebody back then, right? I don't have an affinity for that. Lewis somehow identifies. Secondly, he was very skilled at finding odd commonalities between disparate writers and disparate ideas. He can see the parallels between the Puritans and the humanists and the magicians and the astrologers. He can find the parallels between John Milton and Beatrix Potter. And partly that's because he's just a very gifted man, partly because he's read all this. But he synthesizes very, very well. Thirdly, Alan Jacobs argued that what set him apart most was his capacity to be enchanted, his delight, his love of story. One of the things that set him apart, I haven't seen in too much of the Lewis writing, it seems often overlooked, to be honest. I don't know if that's fair or not, but it seems like it. But he's a very competitive man, very combative man. He loved to take a stand. We have people in this room who love to take a stand. And he was very good at it. And then, of course, this also is mixed with a mercy and a compassion and a generosity. It's really quite a compelling mix. But that combativeness, I think, is important. And then finally, of course, he's an artful and engaging and creative writer. His images aren't necessarily balanced. They're often over the top, and you kind of have to work at it a little bit sometimes. First page, very first page of English literature He criticizes the literature of the early 16th century as ruthless bludgeon work. Oh my goodness. My seminar students come to mind again. They think I'm harsh. I'm not. I didn't say any one of their papers was ruthless bludgeon work. He goes on, nothing is light or tender or fresh. All the authors write like elderly men. What a great image, right? What a great, I mean, the imagery alone is worth the price of admission. He says elsewhere, and I've forgotten where it is, he loves to read Rudyard Kipling, one of his favorite authors to read. And he reads. It's like, going to Dairy Queen and getting as many blizzards as you want. And then he gets sick of Rudyard Kipling, he says, because Rudyard Kipling is all vitamins and no fiber. What? Where did that come from? But there it is. Let me encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to move past the apologetics and the science fiction and the Narnia stories. They're wonderful. I don't have any problem with his stories or his essays. But if you haven't done so already, pick up his literary histories and his criticism. The Discarded Image might be the place to start. It seems like the most accessible. But it's delightful reading. It's humbling reading. It's amazing how much the man knew. But his knowledge and his skill and his personality are on full display. I think unlike anywhere else in his writing, to be honest. And it's really worth the excursion. Back to the arguments. We've talked briefly about the Augustinian influence. We've talked briefly about his formal literary histories. Now to his advocacy. Memory and hope work together, as I said a few minutes ago. We use stories from the past to make decisions in the present that hopefully will influence and bring benefit in the future. It's as natural as breathing, right? You inhale the past, and you filter out some of the useful oxygen, and you exhale the rest all the time. When we want to understand who we are, where we're going, what our problems are, every time we look to the past. Right? We don't have any choice, right? It's the only resource we have, to be quite honest. Of course the past is a guide. It's so normal. The other normal thing about history that's often overlooked, the past we use as an interpretation. The past never comes to us virginal and innocent and untouched by others. It just doesn't. Getting the facts right is part of it. Getting what they mean is equally important. Again, a Narnia story, which I hope you've read, right? Jadis explains your use of the deplorable word. I've forgotten which one this is in. Jadis explains her use of the deplorable word, as if it's as obvious as cold water on a hot day. The deplorable word is the thing she uses to destroy. Jill and Eustace are aghast, right? Same event, same idea, but the interpretation is totally different. And this is important. Interpretation implies what? Interpretation implies the possibility of disagreement and change, not only between me and you, right? Not only between people, but within a person, right? Whatever interpretation you agree to today, it doesn't matter what it is. Whatever interpretation you agree to today might be overthrown tomorrow. And it almost certainly is going to be modified in 30 years. Right? It doesn't matter how foundational it is. We're talking about anything associated with religious faith or family, employment. It's almost certainly going to be different in 30 years. All this is preliminary to my argument about Lewis. I've forgotten where this picture comes from. I didn't label it. I should have. But the image on the bottom, of course, is what I'm after, the jousting tournament. Sometimes the past is more than a guide. Right? Sometimes the past is prophetic. It demands change. The present has to be challenged and will be unhorsed, will be overthrown. Somebody else has pulled the sword out of the stone. And the fashions and convictions of today are not omnipotent. Now, obviously, Lewis recognized that going back in time is not possible. Okay? Post-Christian does not mean pagan. Let me explore two ways in which Lewis expresses this. The first one in fiction. Book 2 of the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, I know different editors have arranged the books differently. Book 2 of the Chronicles of Narnia is Prince Caspian. The usurper Miraz is overthrown with the aid of the 4 Pevensey children, and as part of this action, as part of the overthrow, Aslan arrives. Okay, sensible. He arrives not only to establish Caspian as king, but he also arrives to overturn the consequences of misrule. Dogs break their chains, and oppressed children are freed, and boring schools turn into forest glades, and you remember this, I hope. Among other things, the bridge at Baruna is torn down by Bacchus, and the fort of Baruna is reestablished. And this, of course, becomes the title of my talk. A fort, of course, we don't use forts very often, which is probably a good thing. But a fort, of course, is a low place in the river where people would walk across or ride their horses across. The bridge comes down, and if there's no bridge, then you have no alternative. If you want to cross the river, you walk across. Bridges to fords. And this is a cause for celebration. I don't think it would be for us. If the bridge over the Tennessee River came down, we would have a significant problem. But in Narnia, it is a cause for celebration. And the river has been freed, essentially. And the whole party with Aslan swim and splash and dance across the river, and the figure of Dionysius calls this a romp. I think this bridge becoming a fort is emblematic of Lewis's resistance to present trends, and especially emblematic of the assumption that change is the same thing as progress. Lewis is grieved, often grieved. You see that often in Narnia and often in Lord of the Rings too. Often grieved by industrial advances and other advances made in the name of progress. Now, progress is a good thing, right? We all like progress. But it also, in Lewis's depiction, made possible the pollution and the oppression and the carnage of the industrial age. Remember, Lewis was wounded in World War I, lost close friends. His friend Tolkien lost every close friend but one during World War I. And they're not unique. There are a lot of people who survived World War I and came out of the war and had no friends left because they'd all died. Everywhere in Narnia and in Tolkien's Middle-earth, that personal grievance is clear. Technological advancement means not progress. Technological advancement means war, and it means factories, and it means dirty rivers and tyrannical masters. Technological progress means decimated forests, and it means simple things, fireplaces that don't draw, and unjust laws, well, that's not so simple, and pasty food, and uncomfortable clothes, and a shortage of pipeweed. And you think, okay, why is that a grievance? I mean, pipeweed, this is tobacco, right, causes lung cancer and emphysema and things like this. Why is a shortage of that bad? Well, not because of the technological or the health benefits, but because pipeweed is this social glue, right? When the hobbits or whoever it is sit down with their pipeweed, they tell stories and they tell their histories and they laugh and they talk, and it's a social experience that has nothing to do with lung cancer. The story tells in the opposite direction too, doesn't it? Victory over evil has cultural consequences. It's not just victory over evil in some spiritual sense, it has cultural consequences. And these push back to an earlier, better day in both Narnia and Middle-earth. New rules are thrown away. Picture the hobbits coming back to the Shire right after the triumph. New buildings are torn down. The oppressed and the ossified go free. Okay, all those little Narnian creatures that could turn to stone by the White Witch, right? They go free when the White Witch is defeated. Uncomfortable clothes are shed, and, in the symbolism I'm using here, bridges become forts. More subtly, though, life returns to being a festival, not a machine. Right? That's a pretty good image. I like that image. Life returns to being a festival, not a machine. You see it in the Narnia stories, especially Prince Caspian. But that description, that phrase, that's a quote, right? The phrase doesn't come from Narnia. It doesn't come from his fiction. That phrase comes from English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. Which brings me to my second example. Lewis's nonfiction also sends readers back to pre-industrial life, and all the time, right? I mean, obviously, if you're reading medieval literature, you're going back to pre-industrial life. But he advises his readers to read old books. He refers to himself as a representative of an earlier age. One of the major themes of his scholarly work is that our understanding of the Middle Ages just isn't accurate at all. Our understanding of the Middle Ages is usually a creation of 17th and 18th century humanists. I mean, even calling it medieval is a capitulation of the humanists, right? Medieval, Latin for middle, okay? My Latin is not so good, but Middle Ages is a translation of the Latin term of the late 1400s, which means what? That this period of time is somehow a low point between two high points, right? That would be Rome and that would be the Renaissance, and somehow the Middle Ages are deficient. They're the middle in between two high points. Well, that's absurd. No, the people who are living through it didn't think of themselves as the middle point. Oh, it's too bad we're living here. We hope the high point comes soon, right? They didn't think like that. They're too busy living their lives and doing what they do well. Same theme, different topic. It's impossible to imagine that in the 1500s Calvinism was, Calvinism, right? And you have as soon as I say that word Calvinism, it's impossible to imagine that in the 1500s Calvinism was fresh and audacious and fashionable, right? Fashionable. But that's what Lewis argues, and those are his words: fresh, audacious, and fashionable. It just doesn't feel right. But that's because we're thinking with a modern view, and he's trying not to. Our association with the word Puritan, he says, have to be entirely eliminated. He writes, whatever they were, Puritans were not sour, gloomy, or severe, nor did their enemies bring such charges against them. On the contrary, he says, Christians of the 16th century are pretty much all puritanical. The enemies of Protestants, though, accused Protestants not of being too grim, but being too glad to be true. It totally flips around the understanding. Right? Now, we get our reputation for Calvinism because later Calvinists clung to their doctrines, become conservative, and this, of course, by definition makes them conservative, right? And they're increasingly perceived as being severe. But back there in the 1530s, when Calvin is writing his Institutes, right, 1534 is the first edition, if I'm not mistaken, no, they're too glad. They're a little bit too happy. They're not sour, gloomy, or severe. They're fresh, audacious, and fashionable. Lewis, which just feels so weird to me, Lewis insists that context is essential, though, right? And that's one of the things he continually tries to do as a literary historian, is pull back the original context and say, what were these people like in their age? And he says this as a quote: the literary historian is not concerned with those ideas in his period which have since proved fruitful. Okay, he's not concerned with those things which used to be and have now proved fruitful today. He must even try to forget his knowledge of what came after and see the egg as if he did not know it was going to become a bird. You have to love his imagery, don't you? Right? There's the egg in the upper left. It doesn't matter if the Calvinists are going to become a peacock or a sea turtle or a platypus, that's the thing in the middle, or a plate of scrambled eggs. It doesn't matter. Because what you're trying to do is understand the Calvinists as they were, not as something they're going to become. Understanding for its own sake. Contribution to the present. Yeah. Can these folks contribute to our lives? Absolutely. He offers the same advice in several places: Narnia, Screwtape, Inaugural Address, some essays, other scholarship. We learn from the past, and of course this is a man absolutely bound to text, right? He was terrible at math, which gives us all hope, right? We learn from the past by reading the old books. Each generation, each community, each family, each one of you, each one of us has weaknesses, and one of the ways we can address these weaknesses is by reading the works of earlier generations, and particularly earlier Christians, right? They will illuminate our mistakes. They will suggest correctives. Lewis speaks from experience. And from that quote, one suspects wide experience. It's a great quote, isn't it? Experience, that most brutal of teachers. But you learn. My God, do you learn? Yes. Of course, the reading should be done with the intent to learn. Right? We must be willing to receive what earlier ages have to give. But if we read with that willingness to receive, then as he says elsewhere, this is Screw Tape, I think, the characteristic errors of one era may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. You read the old books because the errors they make are going to be different than the errors we make. And the truths that they are very aware of are truths perhaps that we need to hear. Just because you find errors in a book doesn't mean it's a bad book, right? Let's hope not. In various places, of course, Lewis argues that reading old books is enjoyable. This is debatable, actually. I'm sure some of you have experience here. On the one hand, Lewis's love for old literature is unmistakable, right? And it just pops off the page. In the Allegory of Love, he observes that his ideal day, I'm sure some of you have heard this quote before, his ideal day, okay, think of what your ideal day is. This is his. Would be to read the Italian epic, which I've tried to read. Read the Italian epic, to be always convalescent from some small illness, and always seated in a window that overlooked the sea, there to read these poems 8 hours of each happy day. Is that your ideal day? This, of course, has nothing to do with C.S. Lewis, but it's a great picture. Jesse Wilcox Smith illustrating for Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child Garden of Verses. Partly I love that picture because I've been familiar with this book now for multiple decades. Well, to be always seated in a window that overlooked the sea, reading the Italian epic 8 hours of every day, that's a man who loved literature, really. It's easy to forget, Lewis writes in a preface to Paradise Lost, that a man who writes a good love sonnet need not only be enamored of a woman, but also to be enamored of the sonnet. Yeah, that works. And of course, even for Lewis, this isn't always true, right? Remember English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, it's nearly 700 pages long. It's a big old book. A third of this is devoted to what Lewis calls the drab age. Imagine the toil involved in writing a rather brilliant survey of literature that one describes as drab. So one thinks that he's not always enamored of the sonnet. You have some experience here, as I mentioned a minute ago, reading old books. My experience has been like Lewis's. It's been a mix, right? Lewis loved the writing of Edmund Spenser, so I thought to myself, all right, I'll try to read Edmund Spenser, and I've tried twice, and I'm sorry, but it's impossible. If you have success reading Spenser, let me know. Plato, yeah, eye-opening. I mean, mind-expanding, but difficult and slow. You read Plato and you think to yourself, oh, so that's where that comes from. I mean, it's just an astonishing read to read Plato. Virgil is fabulous, one of my favorite authors. Thomas à Kempis, stalwart, wise on every page. In other words, delight is certainly possible reading the old books. It's not a guarantee, but it's certainly possible. And that delight is what Lewis is going for. Right? Now, we could be more highfalutin. And I could tell you it's going to broaden your aesthetic appreciation. Okay, that's fine. But that's not what Lewis is going for. Okay? What he's going for is delight. He's chasing after delight partly for its own sake. He's chasing after delight because he's enchanted and wants you to be enchanted. Now, I understand skepticism and cynicism have their place. Yes, absolutely. Doubt has its place. Absolutely. But other things are more basic, right? Love is more basic. Trust is more basic. Delight, joy. Delight aids our transformation into people who exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. Right? Delight aids our transformation into people who exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. And this, both the delight and the transformation, is the past unhorsing the present. Right? If reading old books helps you unseat some of your vices and helps build some of your virtues, then that's the past unseating the present. Right? And the delight isn't just the delight in the old books, that's part of it. The delight is also in the goodness and truth and the beauty that these books contain. Here's another way to put it. English professor Dennis Danielson observed that Lewis's inaugural address is not simply about exposing and explaining the literature and the ideals of earlier peoples, right? It's also and even overwhelmingly a critique of modernism. I don't know what images that generates in your mind, a critique of modernism, but it's valuable to remember that we're talking about not only the ideas. When we say a critique of modernism, it's not just the ideas. It's also the desires and the emotions and the willingness, yes, to see life as a festival, not as a machine. And I think Danielson is talking about Lewis's inaugural address in 1954. We could say that about, I think, a great deal of Lewis's writing in general. He wants us to see life as a festival and not as a machine. Last quote. It's my settled conviction, wrote Lewis in 1954, that in order to read Old Western literature aright, you must suspend most of the responses and unlearn most of the habits that you've acquired in reading modern literature. Yeah? If you want to read it well, you've got to read it differently. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to challenge modernism and see life as a festival, not as a machine, then the bridges become forts and you can go play in the water. But it's not just the ideas, right? He's holding out for an openness to receive. He's holding out for a willingness to delight in whatever truth and goodness and beauty you find. He wants you to hold out for actions that edify and bring life and endure. Yeah. Okay, enough. There's more to say. But, like Reginald, there he is, the ancient Grail Knight from Indiana Jones, here I will surrender my sword, and thank you for your attention.